On the morning of January 8, 1902, a steam train raced into the tunnel under Park Avenue and never saw the train stopped ahead of it. The engineer was blind. Smoke from 100 locomotives had filled the tunnel like a wall of gray fog, and by the time he felt the impact, 15 people were dying in the wreckage, some of them scalded to death by the escaping steam. But that disaster is the only reason Grand Central Terminal exists. This is the story of the machines that built it. The engineer's name was John Whisker, and he had done nothing that 1,000 other men would not have done in that same cab. The signal telling him to stop was burning red somewhere ahead of him in the dark, but he could not see his own hand in front of his face. A jury agreed. Whisker was tried for manslaughter, and he was acquitted, because the thing that killed those 15 people was not one man. It was the smoke, and the smoke was everywhere. To understand why, you have to picture what New York had already built on this spot. Back in 1871, the railroad king Cornelius Vanderbilt had opened a cathedral of iron and glass, here called Grand Central Depot, and for its time, it was one of the largest interior spaces in the entire country. Trains rolled straight into a shed longer than a city block, under a great arched roof of wrought iron and glass. It was a genuine wonder, but it was a wonder built for a smaller world, and that world was already gone. Because the trains kept coming, and they never stopped coming. Within 30 years, that depot was swallowing something on the order of 11.5 million passengers a year. On its busiest days, a train arrived or departed roughly every 45 seconds, 700 of them from dawn to dark, and every single one was pulled by a steam locomotive burning coal. The railroad had already been forced to sink part of its tracks into a cut running down the middle of what became Park Avenue, and then to roof long stretches of that cut over. What they had created, almost without noticing, was miles of covered tunnel with hundreds of coal fires crawling through it, every hour of every day. The railroad was not blind to the strain it was under. Around the turn of the century, it had already gutted and rebuilt the head house once, enlarging the old depot and even renaming it Grand Central Station, in the hope that a bigger building could somehow absorb the crush. But you cannot solve a smoke problem by adding more waiting rooms. The train still ran on coal, the tunnels still filled with soot, and the fundamental danger sitting underneath Park Avenue had not changed by a single degree. If anything, forcing even more trains through the same poisoned tunnels only made the next disaster more certain. Those tunnels filled with smoke and steam until engineers were driving half-blind past their own signals. The 1902 crash was not even the first of its kind. A similar collision had killed people in almost exactly the same stretch of tunnel years earlier. But 15 dead in a single morning was a number the city could not swallow, and the newspapers ran the horror of it for weeks on end. So the state of New York did something drastic. It passed a law banning steam locomotives from Manhattan altogether, with a hard deadline a few years out. After that date, no steam engine could legally run south of the Harlem River. In one stroke, the busiest railroad terminal in America had just been told that the only kind of engine it owned was now against the law. If you find engineering history like this fascinating, the machines and the people all tangled up together, consider subscribing, because that is every single video we make on this channel. Now think about what that law actually demanded. The New York Central could not simply swap out its engines, because electric traction on this scale barely existed anywhere in the world yet, and the railroad could not shut down for even a single day, because 100,000 people leaned on it to get in and out of the city. So they had to do 3 impossible things at once: invent a new way to move their trains, tear down the busiest station in the country, and build a far bigger one in its place, all without ever once closing the doors to the public. Most companies would have called that flatly impossible. One man looked at the same problem and saw an opportunity so audacious it would end up redrawing the map of Manhattan. His name was William Wilgus, and he was the chief engineer of the New York Central. Wilgus had almost no formal schooling. He had taught himself engineering out of books and climbed the railroad grade by grade, until early in 1903 he was made a vice president, placed in charge of the entire rebuilding. He is the single biggest reason Grand Central looks the way it does, and almost nobody outside of engineering has ever heard of him. Wilgus understood something the moment that steam ban passed. If the trains ran on electricity instead of coal, they produced no smoke at all. And if there was no smoke, then for the first time in the history of railroading, the tracks did not need to sit out in the open air to breathe. They could be buried completely, sealed under a solid roof, with the city walking around up above as if the railroad were not even there. Then he pushed the idea further than anyone else had dared to. He proposed stacking the entire train yard onto two separate underground levels, long-distance express trains on the upper deck, commuter trains on the lower one. In a single design, he had doubled the capacity of the site without claiming 1 extra inch of land at street level. But burying the tracks solved one problem and immediately created another one. This was some of the most expensive real estate on the planet, and the railroad was about to bury tens of millions of dollars in a hole in the ground that on its own produced absolutely nothing. So Wilgus asked a question no railroad man had ever thought to ask. If we roof these tracks over completely, then who owns the air above the roof? The answer would change cities forever. Once the tracks were sealed beneath a solid deck, the empty space above them became buildable land, and that land belonged to the railroad. They could lease it out and let developers raise hotels and office towers directly on top of the running trains, and the rent from those buildings would pay off the entire terminal. Wilgus laid it out in his own writing in cold, brilliant terms. He wrote that from the air itself would be taken the wealth to finance changes that were otherwise non-productive. They were not selling land. They were selling the empty AIR above the trains, and that air would turn out to be worth a fortune. That one idea quietly funded everything you are about to see. It also conjured an entire district of Manhattan out of nothing. Over the next 2 decades, a whole stretch of Park Avenue rose up on that leased air, hotel after hotel and tower after tower. The Biltmore, the Commodore, the Roosevelt, the Graybar Building. Eventually the Waldorf Astoria itself, standing on the air rights above the tracks. People started calling the whole neighborhood Terminal City, and all of it was built on a steel raft floating above trains that never stopped moving underneath. In effect, the station was being engineered to pay for an entire skyline that would rise up on top of it. But none of it worked without the electricity, and the electricity was its own enormous gamble. To pull it off, Wilgus turned to one of the few men alive who truly understood electric railways, an inventor named Frank Sprague, often called the father of electric traction. Together, they developed a new kind of power rail for the job. Instead of a live rail, you contacted from the top, where rain and snow and a careless boot could all reach it. They built an underrunning third rail, touched from below and shielded over the top and sides with a wooden cover. It carried 660 volts of direct current. That wooden shield kept the ice and snow off the contact, and, just as importantly, it kept the men working down in those tunnels from brushing up against their own death by accident. 660 volts does not give a man a second chance. In tunnels that were still half construction site, with crews stringing rail and pouring concrete only a few feet away from a current that could kill on contact, that simple wooden cover was, for a great many of those men, the only thing standing between an ordinary shift and a fatal one. Feeding that rail took real muscle. The railroad built 2 enormous powerhouses just to generate the current, one at Port Morris in the Bronx and another at Glenwood, up in Yonkers, and each of them could put out somewhere around 40,000 horsepower. From those plants, high voltage current ran out to substations along the line, was stepped down, and was poured into the third rail. The locomotives that ran on it were squat, heavy, high horsepower electric machines that could haul a full express train in near silence, right through tunnels where a steam engine would have thrown up a choking column of black smoke. Getting to that machine had taken years of grinding work by a special commission of engineers that Wilgus had assembled, and more than one experimental locomotive built and tested and rejected before they finally had an engine that could reliably pull the heaviest trains in the country. The first all-electric train ran into the terminal at the very end of 1906, and within weeks, regular electric service was reaching out to the suburbs. For one shining moment, it looked like Wilgus had pulled off a clean and total miracle. We are only just getting to the hardest and darkest part of this build now, so if this is your kind of story, take 1 second and subscribe before we go on. Because the miracle broke, and it broke violently. On a February day in 1907, one of those brand new electric trains came into a curve at Woodlawn, up in the Bronx, carrying too much speed, jumped the rails, and tore itself apart. Around 20 people were killed. And the blame landed, hard and fast, on the design of the electric locomotive itself, on the very machines Wilgus had championed to the world. Critics argued that the locomotive's stiff, rigid frame had hammered the track and thrown the train straight off the curve. Overnight, Wilgus went from the visionary of the age to the man whose miracle had killed 20 passengers. What he did next tells you almost everything about him. Wilgus was terrified that the railroad was going to make him the scapegoat for the wreck, so he carefully wrote down the full record of his own engineering decisions in order to protect himself. The railroad's lawyers, sensing the liability closing in, pressured him to destroy those papers. He appeared to go along with it, and then quietly reconstructed the entire record in secret, so that the truth could not simply be buried along with his career. Later analysis suggested that the locomotive design really had been part of the cause, and the railroad quietly went back and redesigned it. But by then, none of that mattered for Wilgus. In September of 1907, the man who had conceived the whole terminal handed in his resignation. He would never see it open. He had drawn the 2-level yard, invented the financing that paid for the entire thing, and forced through the electrification that made all of it possible. And then he was gone before a single passenger ever walked across the finished concourse. Other men would cut the ribbon and pose for the photographs and take the credit. The building that towers over Park Avenue today is, in a real sense, the monument of a man who was pushed out before the walls ever went up. The physical work, though, was already roaring ahead, and it was unlike anything construction had ever attempted before. Back in the summer of 1903, the contract to carve out the new 2-level yard had gone to a New York firm, the O'Rourke Construction Company, run by a hard-driving engineer named John O'Rourke. If you go searching for that firm today, be careful, because it is not the giant modern international company with a similar-sounding name. This was a turn-of-the-century American outfit, and above it, the railroad itself acted as the master coordinator over the entire project, treating the terminal less like a building and far more like one single vast machine with 1,000 moving parts that all had to mesh. And here is the part that still leaves engineers shaking their heads. They did the whole thing without ever stopping the trains. Every single day, through the entire 10 years of demolition and construction, somewhere between 75,000 and 100,000 passengers kept right on walking through the station and boarding their trains, while just a few feet away, crews were blasting rock and swinging steel. The trick was to divide the whole enormous site lengthwise into 12 long strips, running north to south. They would build a brand new section on one strip, shift the live trains over onto it, then tear out and rebuild the old strip right beside it, and then repeat over and over and over, effectively walking the entire working station sideways across itself. It demanded a level of coordination so precise that the operating men and the construction men had to agree on the exact position of every track, every single hour of every day. A single wrong move could send a rush hour train straight into a work crew, with hundreds of lives riding on getting every decision right. To take some of the pressure off, parts of the operation were shifted for a while into a temporary building nearby, so that the busiest functions had somewhere to go while their permanent home was being ripped out from underneath them. Piece by piece, strip by strip, the entire living station was rebuilt around the passengers, most of whom never had the slightest idea how close the whole thing was running to the edge. What they were digging down into was not soft ground. It was Manhattan schist, the hard gray bedrock that the whole city is anchored to. To get the 2 levels deep enough, crews drilled and blasted their way down, in places dozens of feet below the street, tearing open a raw, man-made canyon right in the middle of the city that the workers themselves simply called the pit. Before they could even begin, about 25 miles of pipes and sewers had to be found and moved out of the way, and something like 200 existing buildings had to be pulled down. Then the steam shovels went to work, chewing at the loosened rock. All around them, tall derricks and cranes swung heavy buckets of shattered schist up and out of the canyon, hoisting them right over the tops of the live tracks where the trains were still running, and dropping them down into the waiting cars. A single bucket coming loose, a single cable snapping over a crowded platform, could have turned that work site into a graveyard in a single heartbeat. Because setting off blasts next to live passenger trains all day long would have been suicide, most of the heavy blasting was pushed into the night hours, and even then the crews would stop every few minutes to let a train roll safely past before they touched off the next charge. All told, they clawed something on the order of 3 million cubic yards of rock and earth up out of that hole, roughly 1.5 million yards of solid rock and well over 1 million more of dirt. And it never once let up. For 10 straight years it was drilling and blasting and hauling, day shift bleeding into night shift. Through holidays and heat waves and blizzards, almost all of it happening in the narrow gaps between passing trains. If you have climbed down into the pit with us this far, go ahead and subscribe, because this next stretch is the part of the story that almost nobody ever bothers to tell. The strangest machine in the entire build, though, was made out of wood. High above the tracks, the old iron and glass train shed from 1871 was still standing, and it had to come down while trains ran underneath it and passengers stood on the platforms below. So the engineers built a moving wooden scaffold, a kind of rolling protective ceiling that they called the Traveler. It crept slowly along above the working crews, shielding all the people down below from anything that might drop. And under the cover of that shield, section by section, men took the old shed to pieces directly over their own heads. By day, they dismantled the roof. By night, they lowered the wreckage down to the waiting rail cars. Taking apart that one old shed alone meant carefully removing more than 1,300 tons of wrought iron, along with hundreds of tons of cast iron and tens of thousands of square feet of glass. And the whole point was that not one single passenger standing below was ever supposed to feel a thing. There came a day, in the summer of 1910, when the very last train finally pulled out of the old Grand Central Station, and the wreckers moved in earnest to finish taking the original building all the way down. A structure that had once been the largest of its kind in the entire Western Hemisphere was fed, piece by piece, into the same rail cars that were hauling the rock away. Then there was the enormous problem of what on earth to do with the mountain of rock they were pulling up out of the ground. 3 million cubic yards of it all had to go somewhere, and it was coming up out of the pit at a truly punishing rate, roughly 1,000 cubic yards every single day, loaded car by car into hundreds of waiting hoppers. So the railroad borrowed a trick straight out of the Panama Canal, which was being cut open on the other side of the world at that very same moment. It was a strange kind of kinship. On one side of the continent, an entire army of workers was moving mountains to join 2 oceans, and here, under the streets of New York, a smaller army was moving a mountain of its own, using the very same idea. If you have to dig out an impossible amount of rock, the smartest thing you can possibly do is load it straight onto rails and send it off to somewhere it can actually do some good. On its heaviest days, a fleet of around 400 loaded dump cars rolled north out of the city, some of that spoil traveling as far as 40 miles up the Hudson River. And there, the crushed gray heart of Manhattan was used to widen the railroad's own right-of-way and to build an entirely new rail yard up at Croton. The bedrock they tore out from underneath Midtown became, quite literally, brand new ground along the banks of the Hudson. Every pound of the steel that went in had a second, hidden job to do. The 2-level yard swallowed a genuinely staggering amount of structural steel, roughly 30,000 tons in the terminal building alone, which is around 3 times the iron holding up the Eiffel Tower, and far more than that once you count the full underground system of tracks, where the total climbed well past 100,000 tons of steel and something on the order of 33 miles of track, all packed into that buried yard. But that yard steel had to carry a great deal more than just trains. Remember, the entire point of the plan was to lease the air above and let skyscrapers climb up on top. That meant the buildings rising over the tracks could have no basements of their own, and no columns of their own reaching down to bedrock, because the railroad was already down there occupying all of it. So the steel skeleton of the train yard had to be strong enough to hold up not only itself, and not only the trains, but every hotel and every office tower that would ever be built above it. The 2 levels of track were deliberately offset from one another, so that the columns could line up cleanly and march the crushing weight of a future city straight down through the yard and into the rock below. In the tunnel out under Park Avenue, some of those steel spans reached as long as 150 feet, so that switches could sit underneath without a forest of columns in the way. So the steel skeleton of that train yard was, in a very real sense, already holding up a whole neighborhood that had not even been built yet. The bill for all of this is genuinely hard to pin to a single number, because the estimates ranged from tens of millions of dollars for the terminal building alone, up toward the better part of $200 million for the entire program, once you folded in the electrification, the buried tracks, and the complete reshaping of Park Avenue. In the money of that era, it stood as one of the most expensive private construction projects the country had ever attempted. And through the entire thing, thousands upon thousands of men did the actual physical labor, down in the rock, in the dark, right next to live third rails and open blasting charges. So here is the honest and deeply uncomfortable truth at the center of this story. We do not know how many of them died. There is no reliable count anywhere. The definitive histories of Grand Central sail right past the question of who these men even were and what the work actually cost them, and the public record is close to completely silent. But what we do know is chilling in its own quiet way. During construction, the railroad set up what it called an accident room inside a wrecked rail car parked in the yard, a place to carry the injured. You do not build a standing clinic into your construction site for injuries that are never going to happen. The men were getting hurt, and getting hurt often enough that the site needed a permanent room set aside for it. The railroad would later proudly record that not a single passenger had been harmed across the entire 10-year rebuild. About the workers, it kept almost no record at all. The city counted the travelers it protected. It never once counted the men it buried. The crews themselves were, following the pattern of that whole era, largely immigrant laborers, Italian and Irish and Eastern European, the very same men who dug the subways and clawed the tunnels out under the rivers. The deepest and most dangerous rockwork in the city was done by men known as sandhogs, and they organized into their own union in these very years, because everyone involved understood exactly how deadly that kind of work was. And yet even this, we mostly know from the general history of the time, rather than from any list with these particular men's names written on it. They gave their sweat, and some of them almost certainly gave their lives, to the single biggest building project in the city, and they left behind almost no trace of themselves anywhere inside it. These are exactly the kind of people this channel exists to remember. So if that matters to you too, take a moment and subscribe before we bring this one home. While the laborers went completely unnamed, the men whose names did go on the building were busy quietly tearing each other apart. The design itself had come out of a competition. The railroad had invited 4 different firms to submit their plans, among them some of the most celebrated names in all of American architecture, and yet the winner was a comparatively modest outfit from St. Paul, Minnesota, called Reed & Stem. And here the story gets a little grubby, because one of the partners, an architect named Charles Reed, just so happened to be William Wilgus's own brother-in-law. In fairness, it was Reed & Stem who gave the terminal its most brilliant human feature, the whole system of gently sloping ramps in place of grand staircases, so that a river of hurrying people could pour in and out of the building without ever once having to climb a step. It sounds almost too simple to matter, but it was a genuine piece of engineering. The slopes were carefully worked out and tested, so that a thick crowd, even people lugging heavy bags or holding a child by the hand, could keep moving smoothly without bottlenecking or stumbling. It is one of the reasons the terminal still swallows enormous crowds, as gracefully as it does more than 100 years later. But the railroad also forced a second, far more socially connected New York firm into the project. This one led by a well-born architect named Whitney Warren, who happened to be a cousin of the Vanderbilts. The 2 firms were ordered to work side by side as partners, and by every account, they absolutely loathed it. Then, in 1911, Charles Reed died. And according to the accounts that survive, almost the very moment he was in the ground, his rivals moved to cut his firm entirely out of the greatest building project in the city, reportedly rewriting the whole arrangement the day right after the funeral. Reed's surviving partner refused to let it stand. Alan Stem sued, and he fought it through the courts for years and years, and finally, in 1920, he won a judgment worth $500,000, an absolutely enormous sum of money for the time. Even the credit for building Grand Central had a body count of its own. But at long last, after 10 grinding years, it was finished. Just after midnight on February 2nd, 1913, 1 minute past 12, the brand new Grand Central Terminal opened its doors to the public for the very first time, and the public came in a flood. Between that first minute and 7 o'clock the following evening, railroad officials estimated that more than 150,000 people streamed through it, many of them there simply to stand and look. They walked into a main concourse so vast that it felt less like a train station than a kind of secular cathedral, flooded with light pouring in through enormous arched windows. The ceiling soared well over 100 feet above the marble floor, and that entire towering space was held up, invisibly, by exactly the same kind of steel cage that framed the skyscrapers now climbing all around it. Every inch of it was engineered to overwhelm a traveler stepping off a train and into New York for the very first time. And below their feet, running on two completely hidden levels, was the largest arrangement of tracks and platforms of any terminal anywhere in the world. By simple, unarguable count, it had more platforms than any other railroad station on the face of the earth, laid out across those two stacked underground decks with looping tracks at the ends, so that a train could turn itself all the way around without ever having to back up. The whole terminal and its buried yards sprawled across dozens of acres in the middle of Manhattan, most of that vast machine hidden out of sight beneath the feet of the city. And the transformation did not stop at the doors of the terminal. Think for a moment about what Park Avenue itself had been just a few years earlier. It was an open, smoking gash running down the middle of the city, a place where trains ran out in the raw air and the soot rained down on everything, an address that nobody with money wanted to live anywhere near. Then Wilgus buried the trains, sealed the cut, and roofed the whole thing over as a grand landscaped boulevard. Almost overnight, one of the ugliest streets in that part of Manhattan became one of the single most prestigious addresses in the entire world, and it remains some of the most valuable ground anywhere on the planet to this day. And the terminal did something stranger still to the shape of the city. It dragged the center of gravity of Manhattan itself northward, away from the old downtown, and helped turn Midtown into the beating heart of New York. The whole idea of commuting, of living out beyond the city and riding a train in to work each morning, was cemented into American life right here, on these tracks. And rising up in every direction from that buried steel raft, exactly as Wilgus had promised it would, the towers of Terminal City began to climb. Hotel after hotel, and office after office, every one of them standing on the leased air above the trains. An entire district of Manhattan paid for by a carefully engineered hole in the ground. The man who had imagined every piece of it never stood in that concourse on opening night as its celebrated creator. The thousands of men who blasted out the rock and dismantled the old shed over their own heads walked away without their names recorded anywhere. What they built has outlasted every last one of them, and it is still standing and still running more than a century later, with the trains still sliding in silently beneath a city that mostly has no idea what it is standing on top of. If this is the kind of story you want more of, the machines and the forgotten people behind the monuments we all take for granted, the next one is already waiting for you right there on screen.